I'm Bert Wides, pro bono counsel for Initiatives for China. And this panel is entitled Hurdles to Foreign Understanding of China Today. I'll speak for a few minutes introduction, then we'll have our panel, and then we'll have question and answer. So you've heard a lot about all the terrible things going on in China. This panel is not about that. But you've also heard throughout the panel the question, what can we do about it? Not only what can those of you who are in India or in Taiwan or brave enough to come from China do about it, but what can those of us here in America do about it? The text I would use mentally for that is a really terrific review that Sophie Richardson from Human Rights Watch, who'll be here tomorrow, wrote of a book about EU, the European Union's dialogue with China. And essentially the conclusion of the book and of Sophie's review is quiet diplomacy, to put it mildly, has its limits. And the general consensus is that quiet diplomacy has accomplished very little. And every year, well-meaning diplomats and officials from America and from other countries have annual dialogues with Chinese diplomats, usually behind closed doors. And while America may beat up on small countries in Africa for their human rights records, publicly, occasionally there will be comments about it, but not much. And the results, I think the general consensus is that the results have not been too much. There was a AP Dialogue, Associated Press headline a year or two ago talking about the upcoming U.S. dialogue with China on human rights. And the headline said, "Dialogue gives U.S. a chance to press China on human rights, but with little leverage." Sophie Richardson, in another place, described the dialogues as basically a rhetorical shell. And with all due respect to the efforts that go into preparing for and having those dialogues, not much has been accomplished, although sometimes there are results from pressure on China, public and private. One result is that Jiang Li is here and has been doing all these great things on behalf of human rights in China because he was a prisoner of conscience and the U.S. government pressed for his release. But basically, the question is, what else can be done? Mr. Gershman at lunch talked about two things: encouraging human rights activists in China, like many of you, to know that we support you and that we will try to do whatever we can to help you. He also talked about getting more information into China, evading the firewall. But the question is, what else can we do? And one question that was asked several times is, how can we get people in the world, but especially for my purposes, America, to be as familiar with what you've heard about today as people in the street, or at least people following foreign affairs, were aware of what Mandela's crusade was about, what Martin Luther King's crusade was about, and so forth. And the question is, how can we do that? And then, can we use that kind of public awareness and grassroots pressure, which has been successful in accomplishing so much in Washington in terms of civil rights and other things, to increase the extent to which the American government will forcefully, more persistently, and more publicly press China on its human rights record. The ultimate question, of course, is if we can do that, which I think we can, but only with the kind of united front of all the diverse interests here, which is one of the purposes of the conference. Even if we did that, would it make a difference? Would China just shrug and just keep doing what it's doing? I think the answer to both of those is yes, but I think it's going to be very difficult, and that's because of the topic of this panel. Namely, there are many obstacles to getting Americans more familiar with what's going on and getting the administration, any administration, regardless of who's president, to do more. And I just enumerate them, and then the panelists can elaborate on them. But one is the obvious interest of American business to use the Chinese huge market. Two are the long-standing questions of trade and of currency. But now, also the general idea that we just have too many fish to fry with China. The American expression, too many fish to fry, meaning there are too many areas where we need cooperation from China. From their helping us on the North Korean nuclear problem, to their voting with us on Syria, perhaps even helping with the Pakistan-Afghanistan situation, and so forth. That we can beat up on little countries, but when it comes to China, we will quietly, behind closed doors, ask them to be a little better on human rights. And there are a number of other obstacles, including our media, which in covering China also wants to hold on to its visas. Not too long ago, there was a story in the press that the publisher of the Post had enlisted the help of Henry Kissinger, to try and get a visa for a Wall Street Journal columnist or reporter, an expert on China, who was now working for the Post but couldn't get a visa. And if you're trying to get Henry Kissinger to help you get a visa in China, and then you're relying on that reporter to candidly talk about human rights in China, I think you're in trouble. And finally, with regard to academia, American universities, and American think tanks, it's great to have communication and interchange between Americans and China. But often a university increasingly will have a branch in China or have interactions, so there are corresponding institutions, and it is Chinese officials who come to participate in panels on China here, or there are academics who are going to want to go to China to write their next book and do research. The same with think tanks. So there are a lot of hurdles and obstacles to getting Americans more aware of what's going on in China, and then to use that awareness to press the government to be more forthcoming on human rights, our government, on human rights, rule of law in China. And the panel will discuss those hurdles and what we can do to overcome them. You've read their impressive bios in the background that was part of your book, so I'll just introduce them briefly and we'll save ample time for questions. Our first speaker, Michael Pillsbury.
Too late.
Too late. All right.
Say whatever you like.
A man with great experience in Congress, in the executive branch, various parts dealing with national security, and his new book, which you all should at some point read, about China's long-run strategy, despite all of its efforts to portray itself as a reform-minded country trying to be a good part of the international community. This book tells what their strategy really is. Michael?
Thank you. To start talking, no microphone.
Oh, sorry. He doesn't really need a microphone.
Radio Free Asia has a tape recorder in front of me. I don't really know who's in the room, so I'll be extra careful. I'm going to talk today about policy recommendations and what my book says about Yang Jianli and Bob Fu. According to this book, Yang Jianli and Bob Fu and many others that you discuss are heroes. They are fighting against what I call hopelessness. It's an op-ed piece somebody wrote for Yang Jianli, apparently. Don't have hopelessness. This is the biggest enemy of those of us in the room. Always try to focus on success and what can be done. Don't get too, don't overestimate the opposition. Sometimes one person or even one act can make a huge difference. And later on, after you're dead, they'll write about you. Yang Jianli is a very young guy, so he has still lots of time to succeed. In this book, I present some previously secret documents of the U.S. government that the U.S. government gave permission to release. Because I found out over the last few years, many people who think they know what is U.S. policy toward China, they don't really know. They have some sort of crazy idea they get from the newspapers, or they just make it up in their own minds. This must be our policy. So I thought I would give some documents from presidents about what is our policy toward China, official U.S. government policy. One of the first documents I give is Ronald Reagan. He signed a National Security Decision Directive. One was called number 120, one was called number 140, and both of them said the same thing. Our strategy is to make China strong. He used the word strong. He was continuing Jimmy Carter's earlier strategy to establish scientific exchange programs, technology sharing programs, inviting as many students as China wanted to send to America to come, and paying very little attention to human rights or democracy. Now, why is that? Jimmy Carter has tried very hard with the village election system the last 20 years. Welcome to the panel. I'm going to introduce you myself. Thank you, sir. Ronald Reagan was anti-communist. Why would he sign orders like this to the government? And why would he keep them secret? National Security Decision Directive 140 only had 15 copies. Later on, President George H.W. Bush signed some similar instructions. And there was one effort to stop this idea of making China strong without conditions on human rights or democracy improvement. It was an effort started by Nancy Pelosi and George Mitchell in 1993. Burt Weides might have been the one who drafted it, I can't be sure. But it was very effective. Large majorities of both the House and Senate supported it. President Clinton had run on the attack on Father Bush for coddling the butchers of Beijing. But after 1 year, this was dropped, completely dropped. And there are a number of books. Jim Mann's book, probably the best, tells how this happened. China got very upset and activated friends in America. Also, people who believe deeply in free trade and the Chinese economy would change China's attitude, they got panicked also by Nancy Pelosi and George Mitchell. President Clinton completely changed his mind. There was no punishment. No Republican said, how dare you flip-flop on something as important as China. Nancy Pelosi did not criticize him, neither did George Mitchell. Nobody resigned. An Assistant Secretary of State had just testified at his confirmation hearing that we're going to condition all of our relationship with China on human rights and democracy. He probably should have resigned. The president completely undercut him. No, he stayed on. So in May of 1993 came what I call in this book, I call it the peak, the highest level. The Gao Chao, you might say, although that word means different things in Chinese. The high tide of the U.S. government's concern with human rights and democracy was May 1993. It's been gradually going downhill ever since. In that month, President Clinton had a reception in the White House. Some Tibetan representatives came inside the White House. Human rights leaders from the Tiananmen incident attended. Photographs were released. Oh, the Chinese government got very angry. And China began in 1993 a program which continues to the present time. A two-part program. One part was called the Patriotic Education Movement. Many American books have been written about this. Nobody ever objected. The American government never objected to the patriotic education movement. What's the heart of it? One part of it at least says America has been trying to contain China since 1840. Yes, 1840. Over 150 years, in fact close to 200 years. Many books came out in China. Abraham Lincoln was the mastermind of containment of China. Americans have been trying to humiliate and contain China almost 200 years. That's one part of it. The second part was to be more serious about friends and enemies in Washington, D.C. In other words, this 1993 May reception shocked the Chinese. How could this happen? We have to not be so complacent about the Americans. And from that time on, the Chinese began to be much more careful about who are our friends, who are our enemies. This is a basic essay by Chairman Mao Zedong in 1936. 谁是我们的敌人？谁是我们的朋友？ Mao analyzes everybody in China. I don't know how many people here have read this essay. Please put your hand up. Who has read this essay? It's called 中国革命的问题. Okay, only 3 people have read this essay.
I think more than 3 have read it.
Maybe they can't understand my bad
everybody
Chinese.
in China probably has read it. Yes.
The essay is very clear. Some people you cannot la long wo lai. Some people you cannot bring over. They are the enemy. Be clear, don't waste any resources on them. Some people are your automatic friends. You don't have to do anything about them. They love you. They support the Chinese Revolution, according to Mao. But then there are many groups in between with different interests, different ways of thinking, and according to Chairman Mao, you need a strategy for each slice, for each one of these groups, to bring them over. So in 1993, it began to think about the Americans that way. And I would say the Chinese program has been very successful. They also realized they needed to scare the Chinese youth, Chinese public, about just how evil the Americans were, but not to let the Americans find out what they were saying. It's very tricky. And one way they did this, just a couple years ago, it's quite wonderful. There's I think you all know the term Zhao Liang, Wusheng. Zhao Liang is a contest, a test of strength. Wusheng is silent, no noise.
较量武士。
Zhao Liang Wusheng is a 90-minute video, still online, in which many Chinese leaders, including military officers, come on the video And they explain the American government has a secret program, very, very secret. Of course, we're talking about it in the video, to overthrow the Communist Party of China. The American secret plan is to corrupt our youth, to do various things here inside China. So it puts on alert. The generals who come on, the PLA generals, warn PLA officers, be careful. Don't fall for this American secret plan. Many people think there is such a secret plan. What I say in this book, no, it's not true. It's simply not true. Yes, perhaps there should be such a secret plan, but there isn't. Now, you would think the American government would say to China, hey, don't do that. Don't tell 200 million people we have a secret plan to overthrow you. And don't say Abraham Lincoln started all this. But actually the American government made no comment about any of this patriotic education movement or the efforts to analyze who is our friend, who is our enemy, where are the groups in between. So this book begins by saying there are 5 wishful thinking assumptions about China that are very widespread in our society, in our government, and in the Congress. I won't give them all 5 to you, but I'll summarize. They all are based on the notion that Chinese evolution toward democracy, free market, human rights, inter-ethnic harmony, all these things are automatically going to happen as long as we don't have a secret program to intervene inside China. This is quite a widespread view in our Congress. Now, you might say, well, gee, there's a Hong Kong Policy Act, which is a very good thing. There's a Tibet Policy Act, which is a very good thing. But one of my final points is going to be to point out to you there's no China Policy Act. There's no China Democracy Act. In other words, the U.S. Congress has not yet got a draft legislation or a draft bill, debated it, compromised, and then passed it. Our Congress is silent about the issue of Chinese democracy. Yes, there's money appropriated for the National Endowment for Democracy, and if it wants to have China, it can. There's money from the State Department, a lot of which goes to your first speaker, Mark Lagon, at Freedom House. It's a very good thing. But this money is not attached to a law that says it shall be the policy of the United States to at least not hurt democracy in China. We don't even say that. It shall be the policy of the United States to protect human rights activists. That's not our law. Instead, we have a series of presidential directives ordering the U.S. government to make China strong. Also, by the way, the word prosperous appears, make China prosperous. So you might think, well, gee, there must be some sort of friction or competition between the U.S. and China. You pick an example. Let's say people say, well, China's innovation level is very slow. China doesn't innovate as rapidly as America, so it's going to collapse, or China's growth won't be as rapid as it has been. That's true. You know what happened? Under the directives I'm revealing in the book, that would be a bad thing, wouldn't it? So what did the U.S. government do? It created the Innovation Summit with China. It's the only country in the world that we actually help them with their innovation. There have been 3 of these summit meetings. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton went to them. We're helping China to innovate better. Now that doesn't have any law behind it. There's actually, in my recommendations in the last chapter, as a former Senate staffer, I know how easy it is sometimes to pass a law when it's popular. I say, why don't we have a law that says, please report to the White House, please report all the aid programs, all the ways the U.S. government has been helping China for the last, let's just pick a number, for the last 30 years, since President Reagan's directive. It's never been done. We don't have an inventory of all the ways we help China. Does everybody here understand Jimmy Carter's instructions that all presidents have continued? Every department of our government is under orders, and they all do this, to form a commission or a committee with their Chinese counterpart and help China. The Commerce Department does this. The Agriculture Department increases productivity in China. The Labor Department helps them with labor productivity, labor standards, the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's a government-wide program. Now, do we have any U.S. government agency to promote democracy and human rights that's supposed to be establishing a counterpart relationship in China? No, we don't. National Endowment for Democracy is not part of the U.S. government, as they'd be very happy to tell you. So we don't have any agency of our executive branch that's in charge of helping with democracy and human rights. We have everything else. So you would think the Chinese side would say America's helped us so much the last 30 years. Instead of saying, no, you're trying to overthrow our Communist Party or you're containing us since 1860. No, the Chinese government continues to tell its people, America is out to get us, to hurt us. In spite, and this program has been going up, as I say, since 1993, while the American assistance to China, I suspect, has been going up even more rapidly. So I think the reason Yang Jin Lee invited me to be on Bert White's panel today was to tell you that you may not understand American policy toward China. You may think American policy is to promote democracy and human rights in China. You'd be very surprised to find there's no such law. There's no such policy. Does this mean you should feel hopeless? No. Remember when I began? No. You should be concerned that the U.S. Congress should have such a draft legislation to consider. We have very strong leaders in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Ed Royce in the House Foreign Affairs Committee. They might do it, but first, groups like yours have to propose it. So I saw tomorrow you're going to have a discussion about what steps to take in the future. I haven't gone through all 12 recommendations, but all of them would help to be the foundation of such a draft law to, for the first time, make it law of the U.S. Congress that it's our national goal to have a certain kind of China in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael, for a really, really brilliant talk. Gave me a lot of ideas and a lot of things that I'm sure, quote in the future with or without attribution. But I would just make one small comment. I think everything you said is accurate, but Congress is not quite the vast wasteland with regard to understanding that all the hoopla about economic reform and growing interaction with the rest of the world necessarily means there'll be reform in the political and social area. When there was an effort to get sanctions after Tiananmen, and the business community and others convinced Congress that that increase in international commerce would necessarily lead to political and civil liberty reform, we said, let's see. And as you know, Congress set up the Congressional Executive Commission on China, which each year puts out a report saying how much did all of this commercial cooperation and interaction improve civil liberties and human rights in China. And just every year, essentially, the answer is not very much. But then the question you raise is, what does Congress do about it? great question. Our next panelist, Marion Smith, is the Executive Director of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. Marion Smith.
Thank you. It's good to see Mike again. I've just finished up his book a week or two ago, and it is a informative book, and it's such a good read. So if you haven't read it, I encourage you to get it. It's good to see John Lee. Thank you, Bert, for organizing this panel. And I think I saw Andrew as well, right? From Hong Kong. Paul, was he here?
Andrew is here.
Oh, Andrew, good to see you. Right, so I'm here to represent the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, which is a group dedicated to commemorating the national experiences of communism in nearly 40 countries. And we deal not just with, of course, Chinese history, but we try to keep alive the memory of more than 100 million victims of communism killed around the world since 1917. And I know from firsthand experience that even those individuals who know an awful lot about the Soviet Union, know a lot about Stalin, purges, and Holodomor, and all of these sorts of things, even some of those individuals, when looking at China today, haven't seemed to cross over some of the hurdles in understanding modern China that I think we're going to be talking about today, and I look forward to being with you for the remainder of the conference. I'm sure I'll say things that are repetitive, and for that I apologize, but they're said so infrequently in town that it's probably a good thing they get said a few more times. The greatest hurdle, I think, to Americans' understanding of modern China is that the voice of the Chinese Communist Party is so much louder than the voice of the Chinese people. Through a number of coercive measures in this country, China portrays itself as the sensitive state that we must be ever so careful not to offend. And reading Michael's book, you find out this is no accident. The PRC attempts to thwart honest assessment and open discussion about modern China. With billions of dollars spent on public diplomacy efforts, the PRC is able to intimidate the media, influence think tank research and research priorities, and suppress academic freedom on American college campuses. China intimidates the American and international news organizations by banning their journalists and blocking their websites in China if their coverage is too critical of the government. Reuters was just last month added to the list of banned news sites available in China, joining Bloomberg, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. PRC, of course, also works closely with top American think tanks, such as Brookings Institution and others, to partner and promote think tanks with sort of Chinese characteristics, as it's been referenced before. In 2013, Xi Jinping named the development of think tanks a national strategic priority for China. I'd like to just focus a couple of minutes on PRC's efforts to suppress freedom of speech and academic inquiry here in the United States through these hundreds of Confucius institutes. According to a standing committee member in China, these institutes are, quote, an important part of Chinese overseas propaganda set up, end quote, and evidence shows that they have been very effective at shaping our scholarly understanding of China. Confucius Institutes censor academic material, base hiring and firing decisions on politically motivated criteria, and are generally committed to undermining the Western educational methods when it comes to Chinese politics and culture. They actively suppress any discussion of Taiwan, Tibet, the Dalai Lama, Falun Gong, the 1989 protests, the Tiananmen Square massacre, and other things that put PRC in a bad light. According to Western intelligence sources, these institutes are managed by people operating out of China's embassies and consulates throughout the country, both here and in Canada and elsewhere. A few examples. In 2011, the Confucius Institute at Stanford, or in efforts to set that up, offered $4 million to host a conference and endow a professorship, but insisted that neither the conference nor the new professor to be endowed would draw attention to the issue of Tibet. Stanford refused these terms, and the Chinese government officially backed down, though Stanford purposefully then used that money to establish a fund, or to fund a chair in ancient Chinese poetry, which is very far from modern China politics. In 2010, the University of Oregon came under pressure from the Chinese consul in San Francisco to cancel a lecture by Ping Mingmin, an advocate of Taiwanese independence. In 2009, North Carolina State University invited the Dalai Lama to speak on campus. The Confucius Institute there warned that the Lama's visit would disrupt relations with the Chinese government. The university retracted its invitation, citing a shortage of time and resources, but also acknowledged having received quote-unquote subtle pressure from the institute. The U.S. College Board here in the United States seems to have lost all independence from the Confucius Institute and its large coffers. U.S. College Board President David Coleman threw a party for Ms. Zhu Lin, who heads the Confucius Institutes around the world, and in 2014 in Los Angeles. And I'm going to quote him when he was introducing her. He said, and I quote, "Hanban is like the sun. It lights the path to develop Chinese teaching in the United States. The College Board is the moon. I am so honored to reflect the light we've gotten from Hanban."
Pretty good.
Statements such as this reveal just how effective China has been at shaping our institutions of higher education. These activities strike at the very core of American life. As Thomas Jefferson said in 1808, the liberty of speaking and writing guards our other liberties. The goals and methods of the Confucius Institutes are not only shaping our view of China, they are attacking the very purpose of a university in a free society. People are beginning to see this propaganda effort for what it is, alas. The University of Chicago and Penn State have recently closed their Confucius Institutes, while Canada's largest school district in Toronto has nixed plans to open one there. New Jersey Representative Chris Smith has pledged to investigate Confucius Institute contracts and examine whether institutions funded by U.S. taxpayers should lose those funds for restricting academic freedom. In December 2013, the Canadian Association of University Teachers called on all universities currently hosting Confucius Institutes to close them. In June 2014, the American Association of University Professors made the same call here in the United States and called the Confucius Institute's activities a function, an arm, quote unquote, an arm of the Chinese state, and used to advance a state agenda in the recruitment and control of academic staff, the choice of curriculum, and in the restriction of debate, end quote. Of course, we shouldn't be surprised. A government that continues to deny the truth about the massacre that occurred in Tiananmen Square, even though we have it recorded on camera and in archival footage. A government that continues to deny the extent and nature of widespread Laogai forced labor camps in China. That government can hardly be trusted to portray an accurate understanding of modern China. The sophisticated, relentless, and well-funded voices for the party here in the United States are heard everywhere, and their influence is felt in widely accepted beliefs about China. It's striking that in business circles you hear quite regularly in talking to folks that you know, the PRC has been responsible for making China an indispensable player in the global economy, and that somehow if the Communist Party were to lose its control and power, somehow I guess all of these industrious, hardworking Chinese people, you know, their hands would fall off and they would just disintegrate into dust. It's quite a perverse argument to take credit for the hard work and innovative, you know, entrepreneurial activities of the Chinese people in spite of all the restrictions economically and politically placed on them. Of course, you have only to look at Hong Kong or Taiwan to see Chinese people not centrally planned by a Communist Party doing quite well. And of course, who's to say if the Communist Party broke up tomorrow in a few years, there wouldn't be tons of cities and economic zones and regions in China every bit as free and productive and prosperous as Hong Kong and Taiwan. But nevertheless, this kind of argument is made by business types here in the United States as unassailable. It's just fact, basically. And perhaps we're too used to dumb communism to understand or to recognize smart communism. Some refer now to market Leninism as the alternative to democratic government and the rule of law, and explain China today in this way. But to quote the late Senator Jesse Helms when asked about this, he said, "If it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it's duck." And of course, the PRC it acts like a communist state, behaves like a communist state, looks like a communist state, and of course calls itself a communist state. So, it's not up to me to defend the integrity intellectually of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, and communism. We're dealing with something we've dealt with before in other countries. And of course, it's, I think, significant in making the case to the American people that there is a moral issue at stake, and it is part of the sort of global fight on communism. And just to wrap up in this regard, perhaps we could learn something from the Central and Eastern European communities here in the United States throughout the Cold War, who worked together and informed Congress and really helped further and strengthen a kind of anti-communist movement in this country, and worked in Congress to establish caucuses and other efforts to bring legislation to bear. In the Captive Nations legislation, in the Eisenhower administration, which continues to this day. I think there's a lot of work to do there, and VOC is here. Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation is here to partner with you to help the American people understand why we need to hear voices that represent the people of China and not just the party. Thank you.
Marin, thank you for that, for your recommendations of what can be done, and also for opening a window on some of the activities of China that have helped to raise the barriers and the hurdles that we've talked about so far even higher. And I think that's an extremely important topic, and the next panel after this is going to go into greater depth and breadth about those activities of China. But our next panelist, Yuzhu Cao, is a blogger, journalist, the editor of China Change, and when I put what she puts out about news from China with what I read about in American media, with the possible exception of Fred Hyatt's editorials in the Post, I feel like John Kennedy, who asks two people who had gone to Vietnam, "Are you sure you went to the same country?" Yuzhu.
Thanks, Bert. I'm so glad Marion talked about the activities in universities, and I'm gonna come down. This is I hope my speech is a good supplement to what he talked, and I'm come down to two individual cases I came across. I mean, of course, I'm not an academic, but as a kind of a citizen journalist running ChinaChange.org, the last couple of years I came across events and news and interactions with the American academics. So I'm gonna talk about two cases. One is my involvement with Wellesley College, very famous college where Hillary Clinton, Albright graduated from, and also my report on NYU Shanghai. So what these two stories tell us, they themselves seem to be unrelated, and they are to a large degree, but there are some underlying issues here. So I'll quickly start with the Wellesley case. Very interesting case, very. Professor Xia Yeliang is here. When he was dismissed by Beijing University in October 2013, there was an uproar of condemnations in the international media, and Chinese state propaganda machine launched a smear campaign against Professor Xia. And one of the articles in the state media published first in Xinhua and then quickly was reposted by over a dozen Chinese state media outlets, was written by a math professor at Wellesley College. And I didn't know that because I don't read Xinhua. I don't read People's Daily. And I only find out 1 month later. And then I was like, it just sounded to me wrong. Why is a math professor at Wellesley smashing against the economic professor at Beijing University? And so me and a few friends, we did some searching on internet. So we find out a lot of things. And we figured out that, I want to mention Wellesley and the PKU, Peking University, has partnership. And that's 140 Wellesley professors came out, wrote a letter to Beijing University against the dismissal of Professor Xia. So there's a little connection there. Anyway, we did some search. We find that this Professor Bu, this math professor, among the high points is that he is an overseas commissioner, quote, of the Federation of Chinese, Overseas Chinese since 2006. And he and his family had once been received by a ministerial level Chinese official with a banquet at Diaoyutai State Guest House. That's where the state dignitaries were received in China, are received in China. Not someone for you and I to go have a dinner. We also find that on his visit, on Professor Bu's visits, every time almost, he was received by local CCP officials, sometimes propaganda department officials. So I reported these findings. I find through these facts openly on internet. All I did was put it together, connecting the dots. I feel like, so in my report, I didn't accuse him of anything. I just made a very modest request. I said, well, you wrote an article smearing Professor Xia, discrediting your 140 Wellesley colleagues, because don't you own them some perspectives about your background? You know, don't your colleagues need some balance, right? So I did that, and that was over. I thought it was over. This was in October 2013. Last year, almost a year later, last fall, Professor Xia was invited to Wellesley by the director of Wellesley's Freedom Project, Professor Cushman, to receive an award and to give a presentation. On the very same day, Professor Xia arrived at Wellesley last fall. Professor Bu, the math professor, published an article on Wellesley's paper, right here, accusing Professor Cushman and I worked together, destroying his reputation. When I wrote my report, I didn't know who Cushman is, and my reporting had nothing to do with whatever is going on inside the Wellesley. My report is from the perspective of a democracy activist. This is wrong. It's wrong for American citizen teaching at Wellesley, working for the Chinese communist propaganda. As simple as that. Anyway, so here last fall we had so finally I had to write a long article. Can you move down quicker? Yeah, move on. Yeah, next one. Move on. Next one. There's some more. Next one. Yeah, this one. So finally, I wrote an open letter to the entire Wellesley College. 39 professors came out against the Professor Cushman. So I wrote a letter. I said, come on, you guys are smart here at Wellesley College. Take a considered position through disciplined thinking and get the facts straight. Professor Cushman is not a racist against Professor Boo, and he's not a McCarthyism either. So anyway, because of my involvement with the Wellesley situation, I did some research. Can we move on, please? I did some research. I find something very troubling. For example, Wellesley's women's leadership page. You have this Madame Chen Zhili. She is the former Minister of Education in China, very much involved in the suppression of Falun Gong. Here featured on Wellesley's webpage as the model of a woman in leadership, okay? And then you have next, please. And then you have these, again, women leadership conference held in Beijing, co-hosted by Beijing University and Wellesley, with Yang Lan featured. Yang Lan is a former CCTV host. For years, she was plagued by accusations of corruption and cheating. I mean, these are not the kind of people our top women's college want to set up as role models. So I talked to Professor Cushman. I said, what's going on? You guys should have a Liu Ping. Okay, next. Go. Next. Yeah. Liu Ping is a laid-off worker in Jiangxi province. She became an activist. She volunteered to be an independent candidate to be involved in the election of a people's representative, for which she was beaten, and now last year she was sentenced to 6 years in jail. I said that she is my hero. She should be the hero of a Wellesley woman too. This former Falun Gong suppressor and Yang Lan as your role model, looking shiny, presented to Wellesley future women leaders in this country. We ought to have Liu Ping. Too bad, she's in prison. Even if she's not in prison, the trouble is Wellesley probably not invite her. You see, that's how brainwashing works. That's how integrity erodes. That's what I'm seeing. And what I'm telling is not just unique to Wellesley. It's widespread. What's happening in our university is that we invite the people, we have guests of honor accepted, recommended by the Chinese government. Here, presented as the people who represent China. Do we hear the heroes from dissidents? We hear the heroes of citizen fighters? Do we hear, are here the civil rights heroes? No, you don't. So, okay, next I move on I'll be much quicker. I move on the NYU Shanghai. Now again, I'm not an academic, I'm just an activist, a journalist, you may call that. Really, in my daily work, if you look at our website, we don't do this kind of work. So that's something I came across rather accidentally, but I'm so glad I did. So last December, I was at this hearing on Capitol Hill, and Congress Smith said that I wanted the NYU people to be here. I gave them this many dates for them to appear on Capitol Hill. I want them to ask questions. I want to ask them what kind of a deal, what kind of a contract that they signed up with the Chinese government to establish NYU Shanghai. I gave him, they didn't show up. They just declined. So I went home, I said, well, you know what? I'm gonna search online, go through Chinese materials to see what was written, reported about NYU. Lo and behold, I find a lot of things out in the open. Nobody was reading and nobody was putting them together to see this picture. So anyway, my main findings are this. NYU Shanghai is not a campus of NYU. It is a joint venture with China as the controlling party. Okay? And number two, NYU Shanghai is heavily subsidized by the Chinese government. Number three, the university does not use NYU curriculum, but a jointly designed specific curriculum for that campus. The Chinese students on that campus have to take a military training and have to take education indoctrination courses. And recently, just a few months ago, the NYU Shanghai launched the Education Development Foundation to raise money for the campus and also for NYU at Manhattan. And the President Sexton of NYU proudly announced that, oh, we have 3 significant donors in this foundation. And I got curious, who are they? Who are these significant donors? And I found the names of 2 of them. And they were 4 more high-ranking Shanghai CCP officials. So go figure, right? So finally, use the official description of Shanghai, NYU Shanghai. Quote, it is a testing field to demonstrate reform on international cooperation in Chinese higher education. Just a few minutes, okay. Now, my question is, what kind of experiment the Chinese government is doing? What does it want from top American and world universities? And it's not hard to figure out. They want your knowledge, okay? So in the last 30 years of China's opening up and reform, Western companies have transferred vast amount of knowledge and management know-how to Chinese state-owned companies. And now it appears to me that China is duplicating the same model of success with American universities and the other universities around the world. By enticing them to China and to give them money and creating these cooperation programs in scientific research and technology innovation. So here is a dreamy picture view of Duke University, Duke Kunshan University. Duke University has a campus now in China. It's also a joint venture. So I looked up China's 10-year education plan. I read over this Hefei statement, which is a statement of 9 top research universities in China, formed with basically the university leagues around the world without missing any league. Australia, Europe, America, England, all of them. in this statement, the Chinese university, these 9 Chinese universities promised that there will be academic freedom on their campuses, and there will be independence from the government. And all these are blatant lies. I mean, you don't have to go out of your way to figure out. I mean.
But I want to introduce our last panelist, so we're running a little over. I want to have time for questions. Matthew Robertson, who is a reporter, an expert on China, and has his own experiences with the kind of hurdles we have in getting the facts out and getting our government to act accordingly.
I don't have any slides. The topic was the hurdles to understanding China, and so I thought it was a good opportunity to shoehorn one of my pet interests going on in China these days, which is related to organ harvesting of prisoners of conscience. But the general thought that I had about the hurdle to understanding China that in the US is essentially the self-interested attitude which governs the US policy, and that constructs a China which isn't the China in reality. And this has been going on for a long time. And I thought another example was simply with Deng Xiaoping. And we've got one of the authors of a new biography here. I recommend it to everyone. I mean, for Deng Xiaoping, he was understood as a friend to, say, Henry Paulson, Kissinger, and the sense of the misplaced sense of identification with a figure like Deng was demonstrated, for example, after the Tiananmen massacre, where the responses of these two, and also Ezra Vogel, which is coming from a similar perspective, kind of just completely missed the actual context that Deng was operating in. For example, Vogel called it a tragedy, but then put a lot of emphasis on officials who admired Deng's handling of the Tiananmen demonstrations, and said that that these officials that he's giving a lot of time to their views say that even greater tragedies would have befallen China had Deng failed to bring an end to the 2 months of chaos. There is also the same thing comes through in Henry Paulson, who said he was uneasy by the imposition of martial law, and he called it an incident in his book, and doesn't talk about a massacre of shooting and tanks shooting people and the deaths of hundreds and probably thousands. And so it's part of a it's not to evaluate the CCP in a normative way, but simply to say that the kind of the relationship that exists in the US kind of seems to demand misdescribing things as they actually happen in China, and not acknowledging certain things that happen. And I think the organ harvesting case is completely emblematic and is the apex of this kind of thing, because if it's to be acknowledged, it has many implications that are not helpful at all for this kind of view of China that has developed. And it put me in mind of the famous quote by Upton Sinclair, who was a journalist who ran for governor in California after the Depression, who wrote that, "It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it." And it's like the key, I mean, it's well used, but it seems so apposite for the kind of the relationship that exists with China. So I'll describe the organ harvesting issue and why it's so thorny when you go there, and what the implications may be for acknowledging it for U.S. policy toward China, or for any other government's policy towards China. So basically, the crime, as it's understood now, is the killing of Uyghurs and Falun Gong practitioners primarily, and also of death row prisoners for their organs, basically from the 90s, probably not until today, but potentially. Not much is known about it. And so executed prisoners had been used throughout the 90s. I'm just summarizing basically the state of knowledge on the topic, or what is believed. And then Uyghurs came to be, were killed for their organs, also beginning in the 1990s. And then after the year 2000, Falun Gong people became a major source. And what's particularly problematic about it, from what is understood, and I will introduce some officials in China who have backed this up, which is quite remarkable. But what differentiates this crime is that the victims are not, in many cases, they're not actually killed before their organs are taken. Their heart is still beating when the organ is removed, because that ensures that the organ is the most fresh. And that this happens has been recently basically been not quite verified, but stated very strongly by Jiang Yanyong, who was the military surgeon that exposed SARS. And he recently spoke to Hong Kong cable TV, and this is very unusual. He's still in Beijing, and then like last month he speaks to Hong Kong television station, and it's basically a criticism of the former director of the Organ Transplant Center of the General Hospital of the Beijing Military Area Command. And he also criticizes Xu Caiho, who was recently purged from the military. And this is his words. It was in Chinese, but this is my translation. For liver transplants, the most important thing is to shorten the time in which the liver has no blood circulating through it. As soon as they kill them, the blood stops flowing. So if there's a long gap in time, the function and survival rate of the organ is low. So later, they would shoot them so they don't fully die. Then they'd pull them in the van straight away, and right there start getting the organ out and put it aside. That's how they do it. So this is on the record, and it was still, the interview is still online. It's remarkable that he was able to say this. He is under control, you know, he's a retired military surgeon, and he's in Beijing. And then he lays a lot of this at the foot of Xu Caiho, who he says, in the whole country you won't find someone else so corrupt, so scoundrelly, and so ready to lie and cheat. I think it's Nam de Yoma. And so this is quite, he didn't talk about prisoners of conscience, but he said this. Recently too, the former Vice Minister of Health blamed Zhou Yongkang for problematic, for abuses in organ transplant. He said, using prisoner organs, this kind of situation naturally would come to have all kinds of murky and difficult problems. Do you know the meaning of my words? It became filthy, it became murky and intractable. It became an extremely sensitive, extremely complicated area, basically a forbidden area. And then he referred to a big tiger being a problem with how this happened, and he was asked, who's the big tiger? It's Da Lao. And he said, it's just too clear. Everyone knows the big tiger. Zhou Yongkang is the big tiger. And then he said, so as for where executed prisoner organs come from, isn't it very clear? So again, he's not talking about prisoners of conscience, but it's very difficult not to see in this, and these two things came out only in the last couple of months as China has promised to clean up its organ transplantation system. It's difficult not to see this in the context of an attempted kind of sweeping under the rug of what has happened. So in the Crimes Against Uyghurs, the most evidence is in the book by journalist Ethan Gutman recently. He spoke to a policeman, Nijat Abudurayemu, my Uyghur is no good, and he's got a surgeon, Dr. Emma Toti, who actually extracted liver and kidneys from live people after they were shot, before they were dead. And then someone in the Public Security Bureau who also knew about executions and medical bans at executions. So then there is Falun Gong. A previous speaker spoke about this, and there are some people that may have missed it, but very briefly, it's obviously, we all know the context of Falun Gong in China. It became very popular by the late 90s and then was persecuted. And then after 2000, the organ transplant rates in China rose enormously. And you saw a big difference between the organ transplant numbers and the number of people that were executed. And then in about 2005 and 6, you know, you had websites that were advertising 1 week wait times, and that you could, you know, which is pretty unheard of. You have to get on a wait list in other places. And then, so researchers made a bunch of phone calls inquiring, do they have Falun Gong organs? And you're pretending to be someone looking for an organ for a relative. And those calls are all available, and they're traceable to specific hospitals. And so a bunch of evidence like that. And so, I mean, more and more evidence about that has come out in recent years. And I suppose the great difficulty for the current paradigm of dealing with China is that this thing's very tricky, because if you kind of go there with China on this, it's like, well, a colleague described it as, it's like being a little bit pregnant. As in, how can you kind of broach this issue and not fundamentally call into question the legitimacy of the regime? I was struck by some of the earlier presentations that basically describe what in any other place would be called genocide against Uyghurs. Simply policies meant to completely eliminate them, it seems, as a group. And in policy discussions about China, of course, these kind of issues aren't spoken about in those terms, because it's very tricky. Like, if you do that, basically you're questioning the fundamental legitimacy of the regime. Same as when you talk about, you know, what would be the systematic killing of tens of thousands of innocent prisoners of conscience for commercial reasons. An extraordinary crime. It then becomes very difficult how you fit that into like a regular relationship with China. It's as though you're changing, when you acknowledge this set of facts about the regime, it inevitably changes how you understand how to deal with it and what kind of regime that it is. So, you know, where that leads us, I'm not actually sure. Like, what, you know, could the U.S. government do in that kind of situation? The reason that this isn't part of the policy discussion, I'm not sure. I mean, it's clear that this has been on the margins of discussion about China. But I guess the point is, it's very difficult to call for a little bit of accountability in this area. And it's a question of how willing the U.S. government is, and other Western countries are, to kind of fundamentally look at the facts of how the CCP operates, and then deal with it in accordance with those facts, rather than with a kind of an ersatz, a fake version of China that omits a lot of the things that actually happen. And I think, so I see that as a huge hurdle. And I don't actually know, it's a very understandable hurdle too. And so I don't know if in this kind of forum we're supposed to then come up with the answer to that. But I think at the very least, one of the imperatives should be you know, an honest policy towards China. So I should think that acknowledging this set of facts should come first, and then, you know, the US and other countries can kind of figure out what to do with that.
Thank you, Matthew. I think Matthew's comments raised what may be one of the biggest hurdles with regard to Americans understanding and hearing the worst things that go on in China, because it calls to mind Jack Nicholson's iconic comment in the movie A Few Good Men, "You couldn't handle the truth." And I think a lot of things people don't want to hear. But at the same time, I think we have to ultimately remember what Michael said at the beginning, that things can be done. We can spread the word. Eventually, the word did get out about what was going on for Gandhi and Mandela and King, but it took a lot of effort. I want to open it up now to questions, and I want to exercise the moderator's prerogative and ask Michael one quick question, and that is this. Excuse me?
Why me?
because it relates to your presentation. For me, 21st century America is divided like we divide history into BC and AD, into BNE and ANE. That's before 9/11 and after 9/11. And after 9/11, our foreign policy has been completely dominated in a new way since maybe the height of the Cold War concern about a nuclear war with Russia of security, so that not with regard to China only, but with regard to many other countries from Bahrain to Uzbekistan, the dominant concern is how does it affect our security and our ability to fight terrorism and so forth. And so my question is whether there's any way to use that concern in a jiu-jitsu way, whether it's about overt Chinese aggression in the China Sea and the Asian littoral, or just the idea that how can you trust a country that lies and violates its laws and constitutions, that we can use that somehow to change the attitude and the awareness of the American people.
You're asking if the war on terror can somehow affect U.S.-China policy?
Well, more the concern about U.S. security vis-a-vis China as a potential threat, or as a country that, as a non-democratic country, is more likely to be involved in aggression, as all totalitarian countries are, or any way that we can use that front page story about what China's doing or their latest aircraft carrier or whatever?
I would say no. The answer is no. The war on terror and the Islamic terrorism and so forth only draws U.S. and China closer together. It's the opposite of what you're implying.
No, I meant as to China as a military threat.
It makes China look better to us. And President Bush in 2001, 2002, had at least spoken of China as a competitor. After 9/11, that was dropped. If anything, what I'm describing in my book about the old policies under Carter and Reagan to make China strong, to cooperate with China, to see human rights and democracy promotion as a very small, look how small I'm showing you. That's a very small part of U.S.-China policy. After 9/11, your question, it got even smaller. Very quickly, the Chinese request, with no evidence at all, to declare the East Turkestan movement an illegal terrorist group. Very quickly, with no evidence, the U.S. government said, yes, we agree. As an example for you, what has been happening in the last 14 years. I'm afraid you may misunderstand me, Bert. I'm talking about not complicated things in our China strategy. I'm talking about passing a law in India and Japan and other countries as well that's the lowest common denominator. Very, very simple. Democracy and human rights in China should be something, X. We don't have that. It's not the U.S. law now. It's not the Japanese or the Indian position either. It's very simple. We have the Hong Kong Policy Act, which starts down the road, requires a report, requires the U.S. consulate to keep track of democracy in Hong Kong. But there in Hong Kong, there's an agreement between the British and the Chinese. So there was a basis for Congress to pass the Hong Kong Policy Act. With Tibet, there was a strong belief that at least the president should tell Congress how many times a year are you meeting with the Tibetan exile government. Not to recognize it, not to give it any money, just how often do you meet with the Dharamsala authorities. Even that was resisted. So just to get the lowest common denominator, a law with just a few sentences this would be earth-shaking in terms of support for human rights, advocacy, and democracy in China.
Thank you. Are there other questions? Yes.
My question is for Marion. I have a question regarding the Confucius Institutes. I work for an organization called Students for Free Tibet, and we were part of that coalition that helped secure the termination of the Confucius Institutes at the Toronto District School Board. And right now we have an ongoing campaign, and like you mentioned, universities like the University of Chicago have terminated their agreement as well, and we're seeing this at various universities around the world. At the same time, there's still close to 500 Confucius Institutes all over the world. So I just wanted to ask you, in terms of the future, where do you think this is headed? Especially in light of organizations like the American Association of University Professors and all these entities making such strong statements against them, yet we still see only a small minority of universities shutting them down. Do you see this going, which direction do you see this going in the future? Thank you.
Well, it just seems that it's, for example, the example of Duke and NYU, I mean, it's a huge loss of face for an administration to have to close down a campus, right? Talking about it there, or close down a center here. That's a significant part of, annual budget. So, to overcome the impact of, large amounts of money being poured into universities at a time when, frankly, there was no one there to, man the moral barricade on the issue. And here I would just mention what I think is another hurdle, and that is that in contrast to a lot of the Polish-American, Hungarian-American, Estonian-American, Latvian-American, Lithuanian-American, Balkan-American communities in the United States throughout the country during the Cold War, who would show up at community colleges if a professor said something they thought was incorrect about the Soviet Union or the Soviet bloc countries. I don't see that in the United States among the Chinese American community. I don't see it.
That's the math professor.
Yes, yes. And I don't see it in the Canadian Chinese community. And I think this was fairly evident and on display last June when you had the 25th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacres. Even a minor event commemorating the 56 Hungarian Revolution or the Prague 68 uprising, things like that during the Cold War, saw tens of thousands of Americans as well as ethnics come out and make it an issue, make it inescapable for the media to cover, make it unacceptable for members of Congress to defend the Soviet Union. You just don't have that. And it's a question mark for me. Why? I mean, I think we've all heard stories about the level and reach of intimidation among Chinese American communities here. Certainly, it's, of course, important if your aim is to reduce understanding of China and to reduce criticism by the U.S. government, that the natural representatives of the Chinese people in this country, Chinese immigrants to this country, you limit their voice. So, my short answer to your question is no, because it's such a huge hurdle. That really is a big hurdle. Those are entrenched interests now. And if I could just mention one other thing, I mean, just the scale that we're talking about. I mean, it's 85 million members of the Chinese Communist Party, 300 million members of the Chinese middle class. That's as large as the U.S. population. The hurdle to understanding, as well as the hurdle to overcoming the interest, without an increased effort by the Chinese American community in this country, I think it's very difficult for simply experts or simply scholars or foreign policy folks. I think it's very difficult to change political will. And talking about anything related to China, the world's other huge power. With our political will being led by Chinese Americans here, yeah, I'm not really confident. And that's why we're here, right? That's why John Lee organized this.
Are there other questions? Yes.
Not to be hopeless, no.
刚才听了各位的这个介绍情况，还有主持人介绍情况，我首先要表达这个我对各位的感谢那么这个感谢你们呢，这个关注中国的人权民主事业这个我非常感谢。这个感谢呢还来自我上次来华盛顿的时候。我到美国的这个国务院国会见了十几个议员他们也都非常关心中国的宗教迫害问题这个也让我很感动，在此以此一并表示感谢。那么今天呢，我特别听到这个就是各位在讲的时候讲到一个就是说讲到自身，就是说除了帮助我们以外，还觉得自己做的不够。不够，这点就让我感动，是吧？就是我们立法可能是有什么问题还有什么关系不够这个让我感到很感动就是说我们其实我觉得已经做得很好了
Anyone want to respond to that?
No, he hasn't asked a question. He's just thanking us that he's been to U.S. Congress to see.
那个我有一个请求，今天我没有问题我有一个请求。
Thank you.
请求呢就是各位因为都是美国社团的那么请求各位转达我是个中国律师，转达我呢就是说请求美国政府你们美国是可以说是一个自由平等的灯塔也是我们中国受迫害人的和老百姓的一个盼望那么请求你们呢关注中国的人权，因为如果中国的人权问题，就是这个专制的这个迫害对人权的迫害，如果发展严重的话那么伤害的一个是我们中国人受伤害，再一个这个专制的这个迫害它会越来越扩大，最后呢最终也要影响到美国的安全这是一个事。而且这个专制集团如果它的这个暴力迫害不自由，如果发展下去的话呢，对他们本身也不好。因为什么呢？就好像一个坏孩子坏孩子做坏事了，不说坏孩子，就说一个人做坏事，如果你不限制他、惩罚他，那么他会做坏事越做越多。所以大家呢，就是说，美国从自己的长远安全，还有我们对中国人的关怀，就是加强人权方面。这是我一个请求，转告美国政府转告美国政府
No, there's no question.
Yeah, can you just summarize what he said, though?
Yeah.
Briefly.
Well, he's deeply moved by American concern for human rights in China. He thinks that if human rights in China is not solved, it's going to hurt. The level of harm won't just be to the Chinese people, it will be to the whole world outside, including American security. And he's been visiting here, he's been up to Congress and met, I think he said 11 congressional representatives. He's very moved by their concern, and he's thanks we Americans on the panel for our, interest and concern in human rights and democracy in China. I think that's about it.
Thank you. Are there any other questions?
Mr. Young says that's a good summary.
Let's thank the panel.
Woman Yahan Gandun.
You have a question?
Yeah.
Come back.
I had a question.
Yeah, I'm a human rights lawyer. I'm also a human rights lawyer. I wrote an op-ed in Washington Post that most Beijing watchers misunderstanding Beijing, but Michael, you are not included then. So my question is, China is a standing member of the Security Council of the United Nations, and China, together with Russia, against the democratic countries regarding human rights and democracy issue. And in the Human Rights Council, the things are even worse. So do you agree that it's necessary to unite the democratic states in the world to support democracy, to give more pressure to China and that countries?
Well, I'll ask the panel to comment, but I have a brief comment. That is that for all the hurdles we talked about, I think the EU and other countries are even more concerned about their economic relationships with China than America. And therefore, I think, on the one hand, definitely, because of all these hurdles, we need as much of a united effort of the international community as possible. If there's any chance of that, it will require American leadership to help encourage a united front. But would any of you like to comment?
Well, I think you'll see in a week or so the what's left of the communist world gathering, showing a pretty united front in Moscow as they revise the meaning of World War II and 20th century history for all of us. And the same thing, of course, as you know, will happen in Beijing later this year. So I think there's a pretty united front on world revisionist history, and a pretty united front on reasserting old authoritarian and totalitarian ideas about government. I don't think you have the sort of moral confidence in what's left of the free world. And you know, our organization last February was looking at the way in which the Soviet history was being portrayed at the Sochi Olympics, and Western media just playing along. No mention of the atrocities, no mention of the tens of millions killed by Stalin and the Soviet Union. It was a musical, right? The hammer and sickle floating above the arena. And we were making the point that there's going to be a material cost to not defending the moral question here. And it's amazing just how much, for the CCP to claim credit, right, for winning World War II is quite a remarkable revisionist claim. And the same thing for the Soviet Union to claim, having been one of the great saviors of Europe when, through the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, they helped start World War II with Hitler. So, I mean, there's a fight for truth, past truth, as well as current truth, and they're very much connected.
Professor Zinn.
Sure. My question is for Michael Pittsburgh. With the strategic expansion of the Chinese military forces, would you think that would be kind of threat, actual threat to United States or the Western world? Or what could be the possible response to those kind of the expansion? Thank you.
Well, if you go back to my original point about the U.S. Congress and our American policy toward China, remember the reason I wrote the book? Government Insider reveals what is U.S. strategy toward China. Your question implies you think maybe American government should see the expansion of Chinese military power as a threat. No. The answer is no. The U.S. government does not ever say China is a threat. All the systems set up in 1945, United Nations Security Council, Bretton Woods Agreement, World Bank. There's a paper you have to sign to join the World Bank. You think any of these agreements say China has to be a democracy? No. You can be a member of UN Security Council with veto power. No democracy is required. To be a military threat to the US, many people during the Cold War even did not see the Soviet Union as a military threat. Soviet Union, more than 10,000 nuclear weapons. So there's almost no comparison. The Secretary of Defense of the last 5 years has used the word disruptive. China has 6 military programs that the Pentagon says might be disruptive in the future if they continue. But do we have any American policy to even say, please don't do that to China for these 6 programs? No, we don't.
And there's a lot of increased U.S. military-China cooperation, briefings of their top figures here in order to avoid tension and so forth, so it's sort of the opposite of what...
Actually, I would add, the Pentagon has increased 500% in the past 2 years, military to military exchanges. That was the level 2 or 3 years ago. Increasing military exchanges with China. So your question is based on maybe wishful thinking. But I'll tell you one more fact. There's a poll every year, the Pew Public Opinion Poll. Are certain countries a threat to America? You know what's been happening with China? You would think maybe China's going up as a threat. No, China's going down. China's now dropped to about 54%, I think was the number a few months ago, released by the Pew Public Opinion Poll. It's below several other countries, or they now poll about ISIS and terror too. So China's going down as a threat in public opinion. Our military exchange program is going up 500%. We now have military exercises with the Chinese military in Thailand, in Hawaii, in the South China Sea. Our level of cooperation with the Chinese military is much higher than it has been for more than 20 years. So you see why I appeal tomorrow when you have your discussion. Just a simple pledge, like China should act according to its constitution, for example. That hasn't been done. That's not U.S. law. It's not U.S. policy to ask China to abide by its own constitution. We actually take no position whether the Communist Party should be above or below the constitution in China. So I like your question. I wish the answer was different, but I'm trying to give the facts to you as former government insider tells all in his new book.
John Lee, do you have a question?
Thank you all. I just want another piece of information about Chen Zhili, the China's former Minister of Education, Yaxue talked about on the website of Wells College, which it takes as a model for its students. She was largely responsible for closing down of China's most liberal paper, Shanghai Economic Herald, just before Tiananmen massacre. Oh, that's it.
Yes. Yes, back there and then you. Yeah. And then.
I have a question for Michael. This is for Michael. Michael, so given what you said about the reality that the military cooperation is going up, and you know the inside policymakers, you've read the documents, do you think that's because implicitly they still believe in the view that by allowing this cooperation, China will inevitably democratize? Because we know that in general U.S. people would like to see that. So do you think they're implicitly thinking that? Or do you think they're just looking at it more in terms of realpolitik, that we're aiming for a multipolar world or a bipolar world with China and the U.S., and it would be good for them to be strong in a realpolitik kind of way? So I'm wondering just what your assessment is between those two.
Well, it's both. I don't see any conflict between the idea of realpolitik cooperating with China and also the naive view that China is going to be a democracy as long as we don't accept them. The main point of this book is too many people don't know what our 8 presidents have written down as orders on how to deal with China. They just don't understand. And especially the human rights democracy community. And the U.S. Congress. Congress could very easily pass a law about the military exchange program. Congress could pass a law. We did this with Latin America. All the military officers who come from Latin America, by law, Senator Pat Leahy passed it, must receive human rights briefing. Don't go home and violate human rights. But that's only for Latin American military. Think Chinese military has to do that? Has to receive a briefing? No, because Congress has done nothing about it. It's amazing how much the executive branch, led by Henry Kissinger, Hank Paulson, all these people you mentioned, the executive branch has its own views about China until Congress passes a different kind of law. That hasn't happened. So in here, I have a number of cases about the World Bank. The World Bank, with the American government approving it, supported the state-owned enterprises, first of all, becoming more productive, and then going public, selling shares. We're supposed to believe in free enterprise. No. Nobody restrains what our China policy is, and I'm convinced more and more the public doesn't even understand. These documents are secret. And what presidents do is make speeches saying along the lines of one of the questions, it's a good thing for China to have democracy. Bill Clinton said that in his speech. All the presidents have said this. They never say, we require China to respect human rights and have democracy, or we won't continue all these 25 aid programs we have. We don't do that. But we don't even know what the aid programs are. Recommendation number 2 from Congress, please tell us, what are the aid programs? So military exchanges is the subject of a letter from one congressman by himself, Randy Forbes. Congressman Forbes wrote a letter to the Pentagon saying, what's the basis for all these exchange programs? That he's thinking about, perhaps he's thinking about a law this year or next year to bring some congressional input to the military exchange program. But it would be the first time.
Yes.
I make a short question. We good. My question is to Michael Pillsbury. Because you described a bleak future for us regarding the U.S. policy toward China, make it strong and prosperity. So, and you also give us some encouragement, say don't be hopeless. And I don't think tomorrow we write an appeal Congress immediately will pass a simple law. And do you have any advice or suggestion what we can do and make the Congress to pass a law which is related to the U.S. policy toward China? Thank you.
Yes, I do. I'll give you an example of a one-sentence idea. It took many years before this idea emerged. It's very simple. That's what I'm talking about. I say something very simple. There were many proposals to change American taxes, change the tax code, change the tax system, maybe give some more tax breaks for this, or more taxes for that. And a team thought about it for several years. They came up with an idea quite relevant to China human rights and democracy. They said, you know, why don't we have a pledge? I don't know Mandarin for pledge. Like a promise.
承诺.
承诺, okay, commitment. 承诺. Why don't we have a one-sentence 承诺? I will not raise taxes. That was it. I will not raise taxes. 5 words, very simple. And they went around, they formed a 501c3 called Americans for Tax Reform. They went to all members of Congress. Will you please swear I will not raise taxes? Oh, very hard for congressmen to refuse. If you refuse, it means you're going to raise taxes. So guess what happened? Most members of Congress, what they call, took the pledge. 接受这个承诺. Pretty soon, presidential candidates who are running to become president, this organization asked them, will you take the pledge? If somebody refused, it becomes a TV news story. Currently, almost all Republican candidates are taking this pledge. It's been going on about 15 years. Now, they did many more things besides that, but they began to change the debate about tax code. And finally, the Congress passed a law. No money can be spent by the U.S. Congress today unless you either raise taxes or you find a cut somewhere. That's law now. It's a huge change. All this took 15 years.
We have time.
So do you have a pledge, tomorrow, that you can write out?
We have time for one more question. I'm going to surprise Michael.
Yeah.
Unbeknownst to him, later today or in the future, he and I are going to write this very simple law that he's been talking about, and with your help and what he talked about with the taxes and so forth, we're going to pass the law. So we have one more question.
From Radio Free Asia, Mike is for you again. Sorry, my question is about Americans' policy on how to deal with Chinese internal politics or internal political party faction struggles. Or after the Wang Bijin incident, has the U.S. administrative government or the federal government learned from that mistake? Or is that a mistake that we should have a lot to gain that of either by giving the asylum to Wang Bijin, or in what else forms that we can have in what kind of strategic advantage or internal information we can have? It seems that we are losing a lot of opportunity and good chances. And now we know that Wang Qishan is coming to town. The number one on the top list, which beat by the FBI, they said, well, it's very sure, is Lin Wansheng or Wang Cheng. My question would be, would the US government this time cooperate with the Chinese anti-gravity actions that in giving up Lin Wansheng to the Chinese government? Or are there any gain that we can pay in this kind of political struggles that it will benefit the U.S.?
Well, I'll try to answer your question by telling you recommendation number 12. Out of the 12 recommendations, the last one says the U.S. government should monitor and influence political debates inside China. That should be our official policy. Right now, it's not. And if you read some declassified documents I provided here about 1989, you find out the U.S. government did not have a good idea of what Deng Xiaoping was being told. Only later, after the Tiananmen Papers came out, Zhao Ziyang's memoir came out, only many years later did the U.S. government find out, according to James Lilly, who was ambassador in Beijing at the time. I quote James Lilly in a video interview he gave. We found out that information given to Deng Xiaoping was distorted. He was not told the students only they're against corruption, or they have this list of things, which are pretty good. Deng Xiaoping was told they want to kill us. They want to kill the leaders of the Communist Party. And it's just after that that the famous meeting is held, the elders intervene, and the order is given. So later on, the U.S. government could have said something officially to condemn the Tiananmen decision. No, it was never done. So Andy Nathan, some of these professors have published books if the U.S. government remains silent about your question, how to monitor debates and how to influence the right side in China.
Let's thank the panel, and for those of you who don't know, Michael has written this book, and I recommend it.